So for years, I made a mistake that cost me millions of dollars in real estate commissions. And now I see the agents that I coach make those same mistakes. And so in this video, I'm going to break down what that mistake is and how you can literally double, triple, quadruple, maybe even 10x the amount of listings you take over the next 12 months by changing just this one thing. And what is it that I'm talking about? What happens is this: a new salesperson in this real estate industry will prospect, which is great. They'll have a conversation with a potential seller, and they're focusing the conversation on the end result, which is trying to get that seller to list the property when they're on an initial phone call or they're on an initial meeting. And what ends up happening is they raise the prospect's sales resistance, and they put the prospect in a position to give the salesperson rejection, to push back, to resist the conversation because the salesperson doesn't know any better. And this was the mistake that I made for years. Call a for sale by owner, I would call an expired listing. And like many others, I was taught to, hey man, try to convert them, try to get them to list the property with you. I mean, isn't that what we're doing here? Is prospecting for listings? Yes, but there has to be a little caveat. And so let's get into what I'm talking about. In sales, what I have learned and what it is that I now teach as my life's work is a great salesperson follows a great sales process. A great sales process has parts to it, has steps to it that if you follow, sales becomes a lot easier. And those are what we call micro commitments. And so if you can focus your sales approach on obtaining small micro commitments, you'll find that that will lead to big decisions in your favor. Here's what I mean. Let's break this down into two separate categories: conversations you're having over the phone and conversations you're having in person. Let's talk about conversations you're first having over the phone. Instead of having a conversation with a prospect and trying to get them to agree to list the house with you on the very first conversation over the telephone, where you have no relationship, no rapport, you've never met them before. That is very difficult to do, yet it's still being taught in today's real estate sales advice. What we want to do, there are 4 micro commitments on a phone call. We call it the anatomy of a sales call that you have to focus on one step at a time. The first step is selling the idea of having a conversation. You can't get a prospect to list their home, certainly without first having them being open to having a conversation, right? That makes sense. People are prospecting every day and not even able to get into a conversation because they're missing this first micro commitment. They get on a call and they start selling, they start pitching. And what does the prospect do? The prospect immediately starts to resist. Phone call is over immediately. So what do we have to do? We have to first sell the idea of a conversation. Mr. Prospect, listen, I don't know if this would be of any interest to you or not, but I was hoping to tell you why I called, and then you could decide if we need to have a conversation or not. Is that fair? And we sell the conversation. That is the first priority. The second priority is what we call the hook. So once you gain commitment, you gain permission from the prospect to, in fact, have that conversation. Now we have to get the prospect in the conversation. Is there interest? As an example, if you're calling an expired listing, as an example, as we get more expired listing leads, as the market continues to shift, the hook might be a question like this: Mr. Seller, I saw the property came off the market unsold, and listen, I just didn't know if you were presented with an offer that met all of your expectations, if that'd be something you'd be totally against at this. And we give some type of no-oriented question to hook the prospect into wanting to find out more, looking for the prospect to say, well, no, I wouldn't be against that. That's exactly what I was hoping for. Boom, we got them hooked. Now we can move on to step 3, which is understanding seller's motivation, finding out. We can have a conversation about where they're looking to move. What do their timelines look like? You can't get right into that until you follow the first 2 steps. And then once you've understand the seller's motivation, you can get into step 4, which is setting the appointment. That is what the phone call is designed to do, is to set the appointment. You can't get to the appointment until you follow all 4 steps. In step 4, over the phone call, in setting that appointment, we're still not looking to sell the listing, because the second that prospect feels sales pressure, you're going to get resistance. So we position the appointment like this: Mr. Prospect, can I make a recommendation? The prospect says, sure. That's called a universal yes question. Why don't you invite me over one day this week? And when I'm there, I'll at least share a plan that will cause your property to sell for a premium. And at the end of that meeting, you can decide if potentially working with me to do so makes any sense or not. Fair enough? And that is how we're selling. That'd be an example of how we might sell the appointment. Now let's move on to the actual appointment. We don't just walk into the appointment with commission breath and start pitching and selling and pressuring them to sign a listing. Sign. What do I have to do to get you to sign, to list the house with me? You don't want to come off sounding desperate. There's a process to follow. And so there are 5 micro commitments that I teach in that listing consultation. Number 1 is the upfront agreement. So when we sit down with the seller, we need to foreshadow, we need to set the expectations of how a successful listing consultation goes and ensuring the seller is okay with that before we start getting into anything else. So Mr. Prospect, listen, there's typically in my experience, what I have found that has worked best for sellers is if we go over 3 different things. Number 1, a pricing strategy that will cause your home to not only sell, but to be the obvious choice so that buyers are willing and able to give you a premium for the property, which is exactly what you want. Am I right? Right. The second thing I like to do is once we understand that methodology and that strategy, I want to break down all the numbers so you can get a really good, clear picture of what you can expect to put in your pocket when it's all said and done. After all the fees, what you can expect to put in your bank account. And then lastly, through our meeting today, I hope that it becomes clear if working together will make sense or not. And together we can make that decision. Is all of that something that you're comfortable with? And getting the prospect to say, yeah, that's perfect. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Then that brings us into step 2, which is the pricing presentation, where we go through some strategic positioning and some strategic presentation to understand, or help the seller understand rather, the right price for their property, gaining their agreement around that price. Only when we gain their agreement around that price do we move on to step 3. You can see we're selling one thing at a time, making this entire process a lot more digestible, which is part 3. The terms or your value offer. What is it that you're offering the seller that will compel that seller to do business with you? Now, I know a lot of agents have questions about, well, what does that mean? What is the value offer? And like always, if you want help to implement some of this stuff I'm talking about in today's video, I'll put a link underneath this video for us to hop on a coaching consultation, learn what it looks like for us to work together, and then you can decide if maybe having me as your coach over the next 12 months would be of any value to you or not. And if not, let's get back into the video. Number 4, now that we've gone through the upfront agreement, we've gone through pricing, we've gone through the terms, part 4 is now breaking down the numbers, showing that seller what they can expect to walk away with. Because if the numbers don't make sense, it makes no sense to continue moving forward in the process. So again, another micro commitment, which then once the prospect or the seller agrees to the numbers, you can move on to the plan of action. You see how this is all coming together, making this overwhelming process of converting prospects into clients is a lot easier when you break it down. Part 5 is the plan of action. To paint a picture for a seller that what happens after they've decided to do business with you is probably one of the most powerful things you can do to help lower the anxiety and the stress that the seller may feel, so that you have a process, you have a plan that they can say, wow, okay, that makes sense. I can visualize myself going through the process with you as my agent. And so this is where we're putting timelines in place. We're setting expectations around professional photography. How does the showing process work? How does the offer process work? What does the showing schedule potentially look like? How do we make the process of selling a home as easy as possible so the seller's anxiety goes down? Once we can do that, I think what you're going to find, like I have found, is it becomes a lot easier for you to obtain new clients when you break down the entire sales process into these mini micro commitments.